As conventional wisdom tells us, good artists copy, great artists steal. The Krion Conquest, an early 1991 NES game, challenges that age-old axiom by both copying and stealing from Capcom's Mega Man franchise, and still falling short of excellence. A product of Vic Tokai, a Japanese developer who I always thought sounded like a sleazy used Honda salesman as a child, the Krion Conquest arrived on the NES in early 1991, hot on the heels of Mega Man 3, arguably at the apex of the Blue Bombers' NES-era popularity. In a presumptive effort to capitalize on Mega Mania, the Krion Conquest shamefully apes countless aspects of the Mega Man series, from gameplay to character design, right down to the walk cycle. It's a textbook example of a ripoff. But is it good in any respect? Well, let's get down to brass tacks. According to the game's surprisingly lengthy introductory cinema, in the year 1999, the Krion Empire, an army of evil intergalactic space robots, all but destroyed our precious planet and demanded our immediate and unconditional surrender. Seems like they might have gotten the order wrong on that one. Anyway, the human race, indignant scamps that they are, refused to surrender, prompting the Krion to start kicking our asses with both feet. All hope was lost, but then, yeah, that happened or something. I wasn't sure what it meant either, and that's really all the story you get. But anyway, the Krion Conquest puts the players in the shoes of Francesca, a cheery little witch who looks suspiciously like Mega Man in a wig. It's more than just her looks, though. Francesca moves like Mega Man. She has an arsenal of selectable weapons, which change her color palette, like Mega Man. And she even fights robots that look suspiciously like the ones Mega Man fights. If you are in any way familiar with Mega Man, you'll immediately notice that everything about the game, from the graphics, the sound design, just its general feel, is lifted straight from the Mega Man series. It's fairly shameless. All that aside, it's worth noting that the Krion Conquest does try to add some of its own seasoning to the stew. For starters, Francesca can shoot upwards. That's not as useful as it sounds, but it does add a little pizzazz to your average combat encounter. Additionally, unlike Mega Man, who has to win his additional powers from his enemies, Francesca starts off with all of her weapons unlocked from the get-go. Unfortunately, though, most of her weapons are more or less useless. But, perhaps most notably, Francesca does have one item in her toolbox that truly could be considered an innovation. Nearly a full year before the Mega Buster was introduced in Mega Man 4, Francesca could charge up her standard attack to dish out additional damage. While Mega Man was capable of charging up certain of his sub-weapons as early as 1989, we need to give credit where credit is due. A standard issue charge shot was somewhat of a new concept in the platforming genre back in 1991. So where does the Krion Conquest truly fail? You'd think that blatantly copying one of the most revered action platformers of all time would lead to stellar results. But it doesn't, because the Krion Conquest is the worst kind of hard. No continues, no passwords, infinitely respawning enemies, levels which are downright impossible without strenuous memorization, brutal checkpointing. It's not just 8-bit hard, it's 8-bit obnoxious. And to top it all off, what's your reward for conquering the Krion Conquest? A poorly implemented credit sequence that doesn't even scroll over the top of the playfield. NES endings were rarely anything to write home about, but this game leaves you with a little sense of accomplishment after you beat it. It's controller-throwingly irksome. And it's a crying shame, though, because the Japanese version of the Krion Conquest, Magical Kids Doropie, isn't even half bad. In fact, it's actually quite enjoyable. It has a continue feature, a more reasonable difficulty level, improved checkpointing, all things that mitigate against the cavalcade of annoyances that make the Krion Conquest a chore. It's not so much less difficult as it is reasonably difficult, and really, that makes all the difference in the world. So why would Vic Tokai make the game more difficult for Americans, with our short attention spans and love of doing things as easily as possible? We can only speculate, but the Krion Conquest is far from the only English-language NES port to be more difficult than its Japanese counterpart. Fun fact, in 1984, in an effort to combat piracy, game companies in Japan lobbied, successfully, to more or less ban the practice of video game rental in Japan. As anybody old enough to have visited a Blockbuster Video will tell you, despite the best efforts of Nintendo and other industry leaders, this ban never took hold in other markets. I can't speak for the rest of you, but I know it wasn't uncommon for me to simply rent and renew a game until I either beat it or got tired of it, all for a fraction of the price of a full game purchase. The popular consensus is that the mere existence of a Western rental market gave Japanese game publishers some concern. Why would you pay full price for a game that you could rent for a week and play into the ground? How did they address this concern? Simple. They ratcheted up the difficulty to unreasonable levels. If you wanted to see everything a game had to offer, you were going to buy it and master it. Simple as that. And that's exactly what Vic Tokai did with the Krion Conquest. They even went as far as to remove all of the cheat codes that were available in the Japanese version. But that only explains the difficulty. The Krion Conquest differs in many other key respects as well. It's been stripped of numerous presentational elements which are present in Magical Kid's Doropie. Each level in Doropie is bookended by a Ninja Gaiden-style cinema sequence. While all these are in Japanese, and I couldn't even begin to tell you what they say, undoubtedly, they give the game's action some degree of context. Additionally, it's well known that it wasn't uncommon for certain content to be censored from NES releases. Religious and political iconography were routinely removed from English-language ports of Famicom games. While that does explain why the Star of David symbol that appears at the end of each level of Doropie has been removed, it's difficult to think of a good reason why all of the cinema sequences, including the ending, have been removed from the Krion Conquest. If any of Doropie's story beats were particularly objectionable, it's difficult to believe that it would have been all that difficult to slap a new, kid-friendly story on top of them. But they didn't. Rather than give it a cut-rate NES-era English localization, they just axed the story entirely. And what did the West get? An unreasonably difficult game with only the thinnest pretext of a plot. And, unfortunately, this has the net effect of negating the positive impact of all of the game's saving graces. Instead of a potentially interesting variation on the Mega Man formula, Western audiences were left with nothing but a brutally difficult, bare-bones knockoff. And it's a shame. Had the localization gone a different route, the Krion Conquest might have been more fondly remembered. But hey, at least it's better than Mighty No. 9. Until next time, this is Steve White for Subspace Briefcase, signing off. Trust no witch.